Who are you? Beneath the expectations, the labels, and the societal conditioning, what does it truly mean to become you? I'm John Fleming, the founder and lead practitioner of Becoming You. I created Becoming You out of a desire to share my own experience of becoming myself and to support others who are curious about who they are. From a young age, I have been driven by a desire to figure out who I am, why I'm here, and how I can belong while being myself. This is Becoming You, the podcast. Conversations about uncovering, embracing, and being your true self. A place where I dive deep into what it means and what is required to live life as your most authentic self. Through real, honest, and grounded conversations with professionals and people who are walking the path. If you're curious about identity, authenticity, and personal freedom, your own or others, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Kieran, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, John.
Great to have you here. Why don't you introduce yourself, say something that you'd like to share.
I'm Kieran Rose, and I am an autistic man. And I'm also a researcher, a trainer, a consultant. I do clinical supervision, a lecture. I write. I do all sorts of different things. And all of that is framed around the concept of identity development, stigma, and reframing both the autism and now the neurodiversity narrative, because the neurodiversity narratives have been co-opted and taken off in a slightly problematic direction as well in lots of ways. So yeah, I use many tools to try and help people understand what that means. And I do it all, or attempt to do it all, from an intersectional perspective as well.
Nice. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I have a question from our last guest to kind of get us going and warmed up. The question was, what would you do tomorrow if you knew you wouldn't fail?
Wow. What would I do tomorrow if I knew I wouldn't fail? There's a part of me that wants to say, put money on the lottery. I would write a law which basically says that you can't be a horrible person, wittingly or unwittingly. I think in light of where the world is right now and how people are experiencing all sorts of different things, I think if there was some underlying framework that just said, just be a bit nicer to people, I think that would... That sounds really vague and superficial, doesn't it?
I don't think it sounds superficial at all, actually. I really resonate with that because we're living in a very difficult time right now.
No.
Okay, so it would be great for you to share some of who you've been becoming in your life. What's your story?
So I grew up in the southeast of England from a relatively poor background, very working class, was not exceptional in any way other than I struggled immensely with school, being around other people, relationships, and had no real sense of self growing up or who I was as a person. Everything was kind of adjacent or in relation to other people. So when I was about 22, 23, my eldest nephew had been diagnosed as ADHD and then autistic, which was, for a child back then, I mean, even now, you have to be 7 to get both. But back then, it was even rarer. So my mum got really kind of invested in the autism and the ADHD narrative and understanding it as best she could. I picked up a textbook one day and it was one written in the 1960s by Dr. Spock, who was not the science officer on the Starship Enterprise, but was a psychiatrist in the 60s. In the back was a kind of loose profile of an experience, which I kind of went, oh, he's talking about me. And he was talking about autistic people, autistic children in that regard. And then my sister came over. It was a Sunday. And she always used to come over, my eldest sister, he always used to come over for Sunday dinner. And I was like, have a read of this and think if this matches you. And she was the mum of my nephew who had a diagnosis. It was all back in like 2003. So the world then around the understanding around autism and things was very, very vague and bad. So my mum got really excited because that's what she did. Monday morning, we got dragged down to the GPs. 6 months later, we both ended up in Simon Baron-Cohen's office. Simon Baron-Cohen is a kind of a well-known autism celebrity kind of researcher. And 24 hours later, I had a diagnosis of what was then Asperger's syndrome, as did my sister. My dad was also dragged down there and was told that the words they used was, there is a spectrum for you, but we don't know what it is, because it was that complicated. When we were growing up, the local kids used to knock for him to come and play with them and not us. Yeah. So then I walked out of that appointment kind of going, oh, there's some answers here. And then every book was about children, pathological and awful, and didn't resonate or connect with a kind of my internal experience at all in any way, shape or form. And I didn't like the external observations they were making either, because they weren't very kind or nice or real, really, in any kind of meaningful way. So I just parked it and carried on living my life as I had been, which was quite disconnected. I'd had issues with drugs and alcohol and was desperately unhappy. I'd had multiple attempts at taking my own life and kind of periods of self-harm and stuff. And then fast forward kind of 8-9 years, my first son was born, my eldest child was born, and my wife got rushed off to theatre, and I was literally left holding the baby at 3:00 in the morning. And he just stared at me for 3 hours, like literally bored his eyes into my soul. And I thought, oh my God, you're like me. And if you're like me, and I don't even know who I am, so how am I supposed to support you? I knew that he was autistic in that moment. It was just telepathic. So that sent me off on this pathway of kind of like, I need to know more. I have to understand what this means. And again, I went and bought books and tried to access research papers, and it was all 99% of it was talking about children. The only adult stuff that you could find was Dustin Hoffman or Temple Grandin's book, which I didn't really connect with at all in lots of ways. Even then, I recognized a lot of the messages as quite problematic that were coming through it. So I joined a parent group thinking, oh, I'm a parent. Like, maybe there's some answers there. And then did the same on Facebook as well, when Facebook was very, very in its early days. And then all I saw was just lots and lots of reinforcement of, we need to do this to fix your child, and we need to stop your child from doing this, and we need to help your child behave and go on this diet and do that behavioral therapy and do this and do that. And just lots of really, really unhappy people who clearly didn't understand what was going on, but passing all of this really myth-based kind of problematic stuff around, a lot of kind of negative cycling. But within all that were these people who were jumping up and saying, have you tried thinking about the sensory profile? And have you tried thinking about communicating in a little bit of a different way? And have you considered that environment might not be right for them? And if you keep putting them in there, it's going to keep causing a problem. And so I was like, oh, you guys are interesting. Who are you? I started talking to some of them, and it turned out that they were autistic people who were in those groups to try and help parents, and who were getting shot down and shut down every 2 minutes because the help didn't match the narrative of what was going on outside that the medical profession were kind of spouting. So I kind of fell into those groups, and it was like light bulb after light bulb after light bulb going off, and like I do that and I do that and I do that, and that's me. And so I sat back. I spent about a year not really engaging, but just soaking up, watching conversations, listening to people talk, and then tentatively started kind of commenting and answering. And then it just evolved and snowballed from there, that now I do academic research. I have a book. Like, my whole life 24/7 is autism and neurodiversity more broadly as well. And on that journey, I very quickly learned that while my story's important and important to me, it's only one facet of a collective of stories, and all of those stories are unique and individual. So that's kind of driven me to look at things, to deconstruct my privileges and my biases, and recognize that when we're talking about autism, we should be talking about autistic experience, because that's a unique thing. And autism is just this construct that happens in a book that lots of problematic people have formulated over the years. And we can apply that narrative to every single construct that's around us. And then that helps it break it down. So all the work focus I do now is about, we need to individualize as much as possible. We need to be not looking at the person we're supporting, but actually looking at ourselves more and reflecting on what we're doing and the impacts of that. So yeah, that's the nutshell version. I could give you the long one.
I can hear the passion bleeding through and everything that you say. And I also want to pick up on something that you said earlier, because people who maybe not as familiar with autistic research or academia or whatever, yes, the person Kieran mentioned is Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, just want to name that because otherwise people will be going, did he say Sacha Baron Cohen? No, he didn't. It's his brother. So you can let go of that thread now if that's caught your ear.
And there's a deep irony to that, because Sacha Baron Cohen was at probably the peak of his comedy time at that moment that I got my diagnosis all those years ago. And I literally walked into the appointment and shouted at the top of my voice, is it because I was autistic? Because I was so anxious and nervous, and that's all I could think about was Sacha Baron Cohen. I didn't know who Simon Baron Cohen was. I didn't know that he was like the biggest name in the world in kind of like autism narratives and things like that. But a secondary irony to that is, that's the funny bit, the secondary irony to that is, since I've really kind of threw myself into this field of, I mean, I was a high level teaching assistant for years, so I always worked with autistic kids without even knowing that I was autistic. And so that's that teaching kind of side of things and the education side of things has always been there. But since doing my academic work and since doing my writing, the irony is that I've spent probably the last 10, 15 years picking apart Simon Baron Cohen's work. Yeah. So, to go from being diagnosed by him, he's a lovely, lovely guy, probably the most autistic man I've ever met. And I don't know if he knows it or not. That's just my kind of perspective on him. But his work is immensely problematic. And I didn't know that at the time. And I know that now. And ironically, have spent all that time kind of deconstructing and picking apart and critiquing everything that's ever come out of his mouth. So
has he ever sought to discuss it with you? Just out of interest? No.
My partner in crime in research, Dr. Amy Pearson, and we wrote a paper in 2021 about autistic masking, which heavily critiques theory of mind and basically said, look, if someone's able to mask, they've very obviously got a very good theory of mind because they're able to anticipate what other people are wanting from them. Exactly. And it completely undermines everything that this narrative has said. And he shared it. And we were both like, what?
Oh, interesting.
The interesting thing about him is that his viewpoints have never changed, but he changes his language all the time. So he's consistently kind of kept up with the superficial performative kind of, like I'm using the right terminology, but the underlying concepts have never really changed. So I think there's a bit of a kind of where the wind goes, Simon will be taken.
Interesting.
In my opinion.
Yeah, of course. And that kind of is a nice segue for us into what we're here to discuss anyway, actually, which is masking. So, I mean, again, how long do we have? Because big topic in itself. A word that gets used a lot and a word that I'm not sure a lot of people really have a great understanding of, actually, including myself. And I would say that I have a pretty good handle on it, but I feel like it's complex.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully through this conversation, we can get into some of that. So yeah, where would you even begin, Kieran, in talking about masking?
Usually, because there is such misconception about it, I usually start with, yes, it is something that everybody does. This is a human behavior, but what everybody does is something called context switching. So that's kind of, you go into different environments, you are with different people, and you might act a little bit differently. You might behave a little bit differently. Sometimes you might change your body language a little bit or your tone of voice or whatever. I always use this example. My grandma had a kind of telephone voice. She was from East London and had a very, very strong East London accent. But if you spoke to her on the telephone, it was like, hello, Emily Rose speaking. And that was not her voice. And like, you was like, Nan, is that you? So that's putting on that little bit of a performance. That's that kind of context switching. Where we differentiate when we talk about something like autistic masking, and this isn't just about autistic people because marginalized groups all have narratives around masking. The gay and queer community have the closet. That's a literal visual representation of a mask. So what we're talking about there is when we have a new interplay, which is stigma, trauma, and lack of safety. Lack of felt safety. That might not necessarily mean a lack of physical safety, but psychological safety. That space in between knowing that you're safe and actually feeling safe, which is a very real place to be. When you grow up as someone who exists outside of the confines of what the neuronormative world insists the world should look like and what you should look like, there is an automatic lack of felt safety. So when you're autistic, as an autistic white male presenting person, I have an element of privilege there because there's an automatic layer of protection because I look like what people want to see or expect to see, what's normal. If you are black or brown, then there's an extra layer of unsafety there. There's an extra layer of stigma that goes on there. So you feel less safe. And you might not consciously know that you're unsafe, but unconsciously your brain is like, no, this is not a safe place for me to be. And as both of us are autistic and as both of us exist within a queer narrative, you will know that when you are with certain people who are like you feel more comfortable. That discomfort is what people who don't experience those things feel on occasion. But when it is your predominant kind of day-to-day existence, when you feel unsafe on a day-to-day kind of basis, that adds up and that builds up. So the reason that I'm so interested personally and professionally in identity development is, particularly for autistic people, is that autistic people are a really good example of how stigma can interact with someone's identity development. So when you are autistic, literally every aspect of your behavior and your identity as a human is up for in some way pathologization or correction or punishment, or even if you don't know that you're autistic and other people don't know that you're autistic, because you're still existing as an autistic person, whether you know it or not. So the way we communicate, the way we play, the way we move, what we think, what we feel, how we emote, the language we use, the way we move our bodies, like everything is up for that kind of correction and is generally corrected. Sometimes that's witting kind of intervention that people intervene with, and then they use different lenses and boxes to kind of put you in a box and say, this, you're doing this because of this, and that might not be quite right. But oftentimes it's unwitting, kind of gaslighting, that general level of invalidation. Oh, you need to eat your dinner. Like, you have to eat those things. Stop speaking like that, or sit still, or like those constant kind of barrage of narratives that you're impacted by. So as you grow hearing those things, you learn to mistrust your own body. You learn to mistrust your own feelings. You learn to mistrust basically everything. And you exist in a world where nothing I do is right. And you might be safe enough at home where you're not getting that from your family. Some people are privileged enough to get that. I was not one of those people. Outside of that, every environment that you enter, particularly kind of Western school, Northern Hemisphere school environment, where it's a kind of an environment of correction and holding space for behavior, everything you do is wrong or is potentially wrong or could be perceived as wrong. And so even if you're not doing something wrong, you're holding this note in your head that, what if I am doing it wrong? And so you second guess everything. And so as you grow up, your identity, rather than being shaped around what you're interested in or what your life is like or what your passions are or anything like that, it becomes framed around your interactions with other people and how do I keep myself safe from their negative opinions of me. That's what happens. So if you are someone who experiences an intersection of things, so you might have co-occurring disabilities, you might be racialized, you might be queer or gay, all of those things are then become a kind of a mix of ways within which you can be corrected or that you feel unsafe. And living like that is exhausting. People assume that masking then is something that, oh, look, there's other people over there and they might perceive me in a certain way. So I'm going to put my mask on and I'm going to change how I do things and then they'll accept me. And then that's not how it works, because we're talking about identity development and stigma. So this then becomes a series over the course of since the day you're born, really, because this can happen around your sensory stuff. You get invalidated as an autistic person around your sensory experiences. So as you're growing, your identity becomes shaped around negativity and these negative experiences. So it's not that you're putting something on, it becomes you. It becomes who you are as a person. And then the narrative, which you may recognize here, which I see every single day and have done forever because I support a lot of late diagnosed or late identified autistic people. Oh, I've just realized that I'm autistic. Now I have no idea who I am. Yeah. And I'm terrified of even exploring that because I'm worried that if something stops or if I change something, I'm going to look inside myself and there's just a vacuum. There's nothing there whatsoever. And I mean, that's not true because, you are a whole human being regardless of what's happened to you. But there is also an element of truth to that because there's this massive part of you which has been living in response and anticipating other people's expectations of you your whole life. And that might mean that lots of people think that means kind of, autistic masking means being small and being quiet and fitting in and being more neurotypical, but it might not look like that at all. It might be big behaviors. It might be the class clown. It might be all sorts of things, you know. So we really need to, when we're talking about masking, those misconceptions go right from the beginning to the end, and superficial understanding of this causes us as autistic people more harm actually than the act itself, I think, because it gives us answers but not the right answers. So understanding this and picking this apart is a really important part of figuring out who we are as autistic people.
What I was picking up from what you were saying there as well, which I think is super important, is that masking also involves context switching. So you might mask differently in different contexts. Like, I know that was definitely true for me. So around adults who I perceived wanting me to be a certain way, I would be, and then around my peers I might be switching into how I thought was best to get accepted by them, which I appreciate. Like you said, everybody does, but I was definitely doing it without really knowing who I was. And after I realized I was autistic, I had this realization that I think I know when the masking began. I think I was 6 and I was in school. So I'm also dyslexic. So there's an intersection there around learning for me as well, which is complex. And it was maths, and I really struggled with maths. And I had a moment, which I remembered after I got my autism identification, where I remember being at this circular desk and having a moment of realization that they all got it to some level. And maybe that was even untrue, but that was definitely how I was perceiving it. They all got it and I don't. So what I need to do now is I need to pretend I get it. That's what I did. And I slipped through all of the cracks in school the whole way through without ever really being picked up. I didn't get diagnosed with dyslexia till I was 24. I left school without being able to speak Irish, which is a compulsory subject up until 18. Nobody noticed. Never got any extra support. For me, that was all masking. You know, I found a way, which definitely involved context switching, of being able to just, like, I call it like ducking and diving or slipping through the net. I became very astute at how do I not get spotted? Like, very good at that sort of nothing to see here or everything's okay here.
And that's such an important point, because that's kind of what you've described there are like the conscious aspects of this, that you can recognize that things aren't safe and you can kind of modulate your behavior. And that's usually where people stop when they're talking about masking, because obviously we can only really speak to the things that we know are happening. Underpinning all of that will have been loads of unconscious things over the course of years, which would have brought you to that point of realization. So it's, although you can kind of try and pinpoint the first conscious recognition of this, the unconscious stuff has been there for a long time already. When I said earlier about kind of the unpicking all of this, the more we learn about this as autistic people, the more we understand this. And people who are not autistic, the more you can kind of try and lean into your empathy and understand this more. We have to recognize that there's all this machinery happening underneath, which is entirely focused on protecting yourself, reaching 18 and no one realizing that you didn't speak Irish. What that speaks to as well, as much as that is masking, there's also a danger that we use that as a victim blaming narrative as well. That's all on you. That's your fault. You hid that from people and you controlled that. And actually that takes the agency and the responsibility away from all those people around you who should have recognized those things. And maybe they did. And that's the other thing here as well. And this is the thing that I kind of preach to all the time. I do a lot of clinical supervision and training of professionals. And I said it at the beginning about, you know, we have to shine a light harder on ourselves as professionals, particularly when we're working with people from marginalized groups and things, because so much, probably 50% of this masking narrative is nothing to do with autistic people, because we're not that good at doing this. We still get picked on. We still get singled out. We still get noticed. So actually, we're not that good at that self-protective thing. 50% of this is on the people who do recognize us, but then funnel us off down their different narratives of dismissing people as stupid or, you know, like, well, they're just never going to get this. We'll just let that go and we'll do something else. There's other boxes, if, you know, working within psychological frameworks, there's a million different boxes you can put people in that all look pretty much the same, just depending on what your interest is and how you want to shape your biases around that. So much of this is about self-reflection and reflective practice. And that's the bit that I'm always really keen on, kind of like, hold on a minute. How much blame are you putting on autistic people? when you're 50% of this problem as well. And we don't have any agency to do anything about this. And you're the people that hold the power.
I think that's super important to recognize, actually, because even like, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about how, you know, I've put a lot of onus on myself to say, well, I was masking a lot and I'm really good at masking and I'm really good at hiding, being elusive. But like, you're right, there was also other people involved. And I distinctly remember teachers at schools saying to my parents at parent teacher meetings or reports or whatever, you know, John's really clever, but he doesn't apply himself. That used to fucking gall me so much. I was just like, if I could apply myself, I fucking would, but I can't. And I'm trying to tell you people that I can't do this. I can't sit down and write something. I just can't do it.
And that's really lazy, isn't it? Because from a professional perspective, from a teaching perspective, I would hope that I would look at that narrative and think, hold on a minute, John's needs aren't being met here. That's on me. That's not on John. John is a child. John has no agency or autonomy in any of this environment that I'm curating around John. So it's not that John's not applying himself. Maybe the work I'm giving John isn't interesting enough for John. Or maybe it's not matching his learning needs. Or maybe there's something, I mean, now I will be looking at John's monotropic. So what are we doing about that? How are we checking the amount of transitions that John's going through? How are we using intrinsic motivation to make sure that John's learning what John needs to learn about? And are we giving John enough time to focus on? So, you know, like, there's whole new tools that we can use now that maybe weren't available back then, but there's still a lack of reflection. That's really lazy professional work to say, John's the problem here and I'm not. And I get this in schools all of the time. All the focus is on the children and none of the focus is on the adults.
Yes. Well, it's like, I guess the thinking is, although I'm not a trained teacher, I never worked in the school system, but I'm assuming that a lot of the thinking is, well, I'm trained to do my job and I passed my exams and I got my qualifications. So, well, it's not me. It can't be me. And I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Ireland, once you get a full-time job in a school, there is no checkup on your work. You're essentially allowed to be a crap teacher for a very long time. As long as you don't do something that's kind of like gross misconduct, there's nothing going to happen, which is shocking.
It's a little bit different here, but the framework applies in that you're trained to be a teacher, so therefore you teach. And if someone comes along who doesn't fit within your framework, well, that's why we have SEND and special educational needs. And, you know, it's a limited framework, which is really arrogant and doesn't recognize its own problematicness in lots of ways. You can apply that to psychotherapy. Psychotherapists attach themselves to a framework, and that framework is the answer, isn't it? And it works, and it works. And when actual fact, no, it's probably been constructed really problematically. When we go back through the history of psychotherapy, we can see that all of these different aspects of psychotherapy have all mostly been curated by white middle-class academic men. All of these things have been constructed really problematically, but this is the problem with professionalism, that we put our professional masks on, and then that means that, you know, if someone else comes along and makes that professional mask crack or shake or makes it not quite sit quite right, that's a them problem. It's not a me problem, because we're the trained ones. We know what we're doing. You're the problem.
We have this awful phrase. Well, actually, I'm going to like distance myself from it and not say we. There is this awful phrase in the schooling system in Ireland, a bit like SEND in the UK, where now in primary schools they're building, because they're literally adding extensions to school, and they're calling them autistic units. And I find it to be the most offensive phrase in the first instance, because it's like, I don't want to go to a unit. It makes me sound like I'm being put in a hospital. So first of all, I think there's going to be huge backlash from that yet to come. Separating people in that way as well, I'm not convinced is always the right thing, because what they're doing here now is it's just like, well, if you're autistic, you go in the autistic unit. There's no understanding of what your individual needs are, which I feel like is so unhelpful.
But this is the thing. I think there's, you know, like with education, like with psychology, like with psychiatry, like you can look at every field and think, hold on a minute, you've developed something, and that's developed organically in some ways, but it's developed by choice in lots of ways. So education, as an example, we've created one way of teaching children, and then any child who can't access that way of teaching, we tell them they have special needs. Like, No, we need to be reflecting on the fact that you've built a system that was only designed for a certain group of people. That just means you didn't think about them and you haven't incorporated them well enough. So we have units here, and the special educational needs narrative is very prevalent here, which is ironic because we also have in legislation a narrative of inclusion in schools, and it's not inclusive if someone's being taken away. But inclusion doesn't always mean being in the room, but that also means that if we're going to be truly inclusive, we need to reflect on the fact that our model of education is really, really limited. And I think, well, I mean, we could be here all year talking about education, couldn't we? I have so many views on that. But plays into capitalism, and it's a factory line, and like that's literally what it's a holding pen for children, so that
pretty much training program for capitalist life.
Well, yeah, I mean,
we're just short of those wartime pictures, that say we need you.
Yeah.
Coming back around to the masking thing again, because I do think this conversation on education is really relevant for adults, because we all went through that school system, and in some ways, late identified adults are also unpicking their educational experience and trying to make sense of it. So actually being able to hear this conversation and be able to make sense of it for yourself, like you said, reflect on it, can be really helpful. I know it was for me, because I was able to, take the parts maybe that I was responsible for, but also see about how the system actually failed me and make my own peace with that. The thing that I often get asked, though, is about unmasking. When I meet newly identified autistic people, usually a conversation will ensue of, okay, I know I'm autistic now, how do I unmask? And there's certain things about that I get, and then I also think there's certain things about that are probably problematic. So it might be helpful for us to talk about that a little bit, maybe. What are your thoughts on that?
So I agree. The narrative around kind of unmasking is problematic, and that stems from that superficial kind of, it's something you put on, so therefore you can take it off again. So when we talk about unmasking, it is incredibly important to understand both the narratives of safety and lack of safety and trauma, because you can't take off your trauma. You can't all of a sudden just reshape your identity overnight. Although some people do, because some people kind of recognize that they're autistic and kind of start following influencers on social media who might have a limited understanding themselves and might talk about the 10 things all autistic people do. And, think, well, maybe I should be doing those 10 things as well. So there is a danger that your mask adapts itself to a kind of autistic mask, that you lean into kind of stereotypes and things like that. So that's obviously not everyone, but there is a little bit of a danger of that as well. So none of that is about you and your authentic self and what that might mean. Unmasking is things like you can, if you have the privilege, stim openly and in public. You could, if you have the privilege, be a bit more blunt. So again, bringing it back to intersectionality, if I, as a white presenting man, stood on a street corner and started stimming furiously, people might think I'm a bit nuts, but they'd probably walk around me and leave me alone. If a black man, for instance, stood on a street corner and did that, there's a danger of the police might end up being called. And, so because people perceive different people in different ways and people infer a threat narrative, you have to think about firstly your safety in what you're going to do and your privilege in what you're going to do. But secondly, this is not just, you can't just suddenly stop being the person you were and be someone else. This is about learning about yourself. This is about figuring out what being autistic means. We met, or you met me at least, through a training that I deliver. And that training was partly designed to help people pick apart this narrative and actually think, what does this mean for me and what can I do about this? Empowering people, giving people more information to maybe have more agency and autonomy. So they're the things that we should be leaning into. What don't I know about myself? What might be useful for me? What's my communication identity? What's my sensory identity? What do those things mean? Like the things that make us autistic, what do we know about those things and how can we learn more? And then alongside that, understanding or realizing that you're autistic is often incredibly empowering, but also makes you sit and look and reflect back on all the trauma you've experienced as well. So that makes you unsafe within itself. This is a trauma narrative, and there is a lack of critical reflection from people who diagnose, the diagnosticians that diagnose us, because they basically say, yes, here is the answer to all of your trauma. Off you go. And what are you supposed to do with that? So there's years of unpicking that happens here. I've been doing this since I was 23. I'm 45. There is no way I'm ever going to get to the end of this journey of discovering things about myself and what that might mean. And that can mean co-occurring things. That can mean all sorts of different things. So this is a long journey that you're going to go on where you get to learn new things about yourself, which is incredible. But also you have to carry the fact that you have been wittingly and unwittingly invalidated your entire life and probably treated negatively and have lots of negative experiences because of those things. And none of that is necessarily your fault. Some of it might be a little bit your fault. And, you know, maybe you could have done things a little bit differently, but this is about how the world has perceived you as a human and has treated you negatively because you are a human that presents in the way that you do. And that's a lot of trauma work to kind of pick apart. So having a really good therapist is a really, really good idea.
Yeah, I would consider myself quite a reflective person. And I think that all the training I have done has definitely egged that on, even where it wasn't there naturally because of what I now do professionally. And for me, it's felt a little bit like peeling an onion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm 3 years in, let's say, and the other day I was sitting down thinking about my relationship with food and I just started laughing because I was like, you know, I don't want to be derogatory when I say this, but what I said to myself, which I found funny, was you're way more autistic than you think. Because I had just this moment of like, oh, there's that like stuff that didn't come up in my assessment because it wasn't conscious for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because there's only so much that you can share with the diagnostician. And really that's just to see like, is the likelihood that you're autistic or not. And since then, there's been so many things where I was like, oh, there's this thing that I do. Because I was telling my friend the other day that I've come to realize that if I eat something for breakfast on Monday that like it tastes good, I know that the flavor of it's going to be consistent. If I eat that for at least another 2 mornings, I could eat that every morning for 12 weeks. And I would not remember there was other options.
Yeah.
Because I would be like, that's what I eat for breakfast. Mm-hmm. And then I told my friend the story of, I lived in Belfast for almost 2 years when I was about 19, 20. I was like one of my first jobs. So I wasn't earning a lot of money and I was trying to, not good with money anyway, but I was trying to, you know, pay my rent, eat, do the things I needed to do. So I decided that what I would do is I'd go to Iceland once a month and buy 30 frozen dinners for £1. And I ate chicken curry every day for an entire month because I was like, well, this just makes sense because it's £1 and that means dinner cost me £30. And I thought that at the time it was really clever. And I guess in some ways it was because it's a survival strategy. Mm-hmm. But the other day I was thinking, oh, this is another strand of my autistic identity.
Yeah.
Because I remember I used to tell people at that time, and they were like, but how could you eat the same thing every day? And I'm like, but why wouldn't you? It's just like, well, that's taken care of now, you know? Yeah. If I'm like, it's taken me 3 years to come to that realization, then like this unmasking or the understanding autistic self, it takes time as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely it does. So looking at this, I'm literally writing a book at the moment on the concept of what I call neurological imperialism. So it's using the narrative of imperialism and empire to consider how neurodivergent minds have been colonized, basically. Literally what you said there, you know, like, how can you eat the same thing every day? Why is that a problem? Just because you might not want to eat the same thing every day doesn't mean somebody else does. But we pathologize John because John eats the same thing every day, but we don't pathologize people who eat different things every day. Why would you want to eat a different thing every day? So looking at this from a decolonizing perspective, which is something I encourage any person or professional to do, to look at your professional life and to look at your personal life and kind of thing, how has my belief systems been shaped by this concept of everything that we know in the world is normative. Everything has been about Gaussian bell curves and meeting the middle. And actually there are human beings who exist in all sorts of different ways all over the planet, but we've become this very kind of white Christian academic middle class kind of focus. Like the DSM, the book that we are diagnosed from, is literally a litany of how someone isn't a white middle class academic man who has to behave in a certain way. And this is rude and this is impolite. All of those things are wrapped up in those narratives. So decolonizing our thinking and actually kind of leaning into doesn't matter what I do, as long as I'm not harming someone else, me is me. And that's a really important place to be, to recognize that kind of who you are is as valuable as who anybody else is. And what you do is as valuable as what anybody else does. There's no power hierarchy here whatsoever. Just because we are told that there is one doesn't mean that there actually is one. You need to be living within your life the way that you need to live it. As long as that's not having a detrimental impact on everybody else, then, you know, you do you. That narrative of recognizing our autisticness, this is something that non-autistic people do as well. They might sit and think, oh, like, I've been doing this for you. Why have I been doing that? So that journey isn't abnormal as a human kind of journey. But when you've spent 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, like I know 90-year-olds who are self-identifying or have been diagnosed, you know? So when you've spent that entire chunk of your life living your life in a way which matches other people's expectations and needs, that's not a great place to be. Figuring out who you are, having that opportunity, I see it as a way of meeting someone new and exploring someone new. Like that's reframing it like that is so key.
What you said there about decolonizing helps me make sense of why I really identify with the term neuroqueer. When I realized I was gay, I hated the term queer. It really never sat with me. Now, when I grew up in the 90s in Ireland, queer was really used as a derogatory term anyway, so overcoming that was a challenge. But as soon as I realized I was autistic, I was like, oh, this is the thing that has been missing all along. Like, now I can really be like, yeah, I'm neuroqueer, and that feels really affirming and really good. And I think that some of it is also because of the political aspect of my identity. Like, I am really into decolonization, anti-capitalist, and that feeds directly into my neurodiverse identity, but then also my sexuality. But it was like that was the missing part of the puzzle that really helped me figure all of that out.
That's the thing. Identity is political and it's used as a political football, but essentially it is political. To start exploring your identity means to face your privileges, to face your trauma, to face the different aspects that have shaped you into who you like. Identity, I quite often use a diamond as a representation of identity because we're all made up of different facets of different things. And some of those are more prominent at different times and more important at other times. But we only have a problem with the idea of identity, or the world only has a problem with the idea of identity when we talk about marginalized identities. If you're a teacher, that's an identity. That's okay. If you're a parent, that's an identity. If you're a man, if you're a woman, anything that steps out of that professional or that normative sphere, all of a sudden it becomes problematic. So it's really important. We should all be, like, from childhood, every single human should be taught to understand what identity means and how identity shapes them. Because what that would do, that would stop the fracturing of these identities. It would stop the fragmentization of people as they develop, because people would be more accepting and more open of the fact that people are shaped in all sorts of different ways and there are different reasons that make that happen. And again, going back to what I said right at the very beginning, answer that question, being a bit nicer to people, that's a good start for that. These are conversations that we should be having. These are the things that we should be learning about from a very early age. I'm not bloody, like, my kids are doing GCSEs at the moment, like they're age 16 exams, and like maths. What? Like, there is no relevance in anything they're doing to any aspects of their life. They're not young mathematicians. They're kids who have been told to do something. And like the only identity learning that they've done is through their parents.
It's a shame, really. I mean, my favorite subject in school is CSPE. It was civic, social and political education. And I loved that subject. We only had it up to GCSE level, but I got an A in that because it was like my special interest. I loved it. But yeah, I mean, maths, I used to always be like, I am never going to use this algebra formula ever again in my life. Like, this is such a waste of my time. You know, like if I wanted to become an engineer, then I'd be like, okay, cool. Yeah, I need to learn this stuff, but I don't want to become an engineer. I'm very clear on the fact that I will never do a job that needs me to do this sort of calculations. If I can use a calculator and do basic addition and multiplication and division, fine. And percentages is handy sometimes. I've got that. I'm done now. Don't need any more maths. But it feels like an assault of that. Like, it's like, oh, here's another thing. Here's another thing.
Yeah, then that becomes internalized, doesn't it? It's
totally. And I would have much rather to been like learning psychology or, you know, frankly, anything other than maths would have been good. But yeah, there was definitely some things that weren't available in terms of subjects that I would have loved to have been learning about. Anyway, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We could go on and on and on. In terms of like looking back on what we have talked about, what's kind of like your parting sentiment?
Okay, so I'm gonna speak to the professionals who kind of shape our lives in terms of support, and I use that term loosely. To be a reflective practitioner means doing a lot of hard and uncomfortable work. Truly being a reflective practitioner. Anybody working with any marginalized group or has the potential of working with any marginalized person from any marginalized group, you need to be deeply sitting in discomfort. You need to be reflecting constantly on what your biases are, what your personal political beliefs are, what your understanding of things are. And you also need to critically reflect on the problematicness of your field and how it has been put together and how you practice it. Because I guarantee you will be missing lots and lots of things. And unfortunately, be causing lots of harm because of that you might not even recognize. And yes, that's absolutely unwitting, but it still is a very, very strong reality. So I would call on anybody listening to this right now to throw themselves into putting themselves within an intersectional framework and really leaning into that empathy, which all human beings are really bad at, not just autistic people. Literally putting yourself in someone else's shoes is a problem, because if you haven't experienced what someone else has experienced, then you're not going to know what that feels like. You're not going to know what the impact of that is. So sit in that place of discomfort, be uncomfortable. And if you're not uncomfortable all the time as a professional, you're doing something wrong.
That resonates deeply for me. I think we have an ethical responsibility, actually, to that. You talked about creating a law for people to be nicer to each other. And there's also an ethical dilemma for practitioners here, is that if you're not doing this work, from my perspective, my personal, then I would be questioning people's ethics, because, you know, to be in 2025 and not paying attention to these emergent arenas needs to happen. Kieran, do you have a question for the next guest?
I do. You can probably guess what it is, actually, based on what I just said. So too often, good intentions get confused with good practice, and biases, privileges, and ignorance can cause untold and unseen harm. What steps do you take to address, deconstruct, and mitigate this in your work? Nice, easy one.
Thanks so much for your time, Kieran.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I'm curious about what this conversation has stimulated for you. Thoughts, feelings, curiosity. If this episode intrigued you, hit follow to be notified about new episodes. I know these conversations are valuable to me, and if you think they're valuable too, please do leave a review. Leaving a review allows more people to discover the podcast. You can scroll down to ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and click write a review. You can also connect with Becoming You on Instagram and TikTok by searching the handle at becoming_you__. The links are in the show notes too. You can also visit www.becomingyou.ie to explore the idea of becoming yourself. Thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.